Hello everyone, welcome to my new channel. In this channel, you will get all the latest and exclusive videos related to 90 Day Fiancé. If you love drama, real love stories, shocking twists, and emotional moments, then you are in the right place. New videos are uploaded. Full unedited breakdown of how Jenny Slatten lost a decade, a fortune, and a dream, while the man she called her husband seemingly walked away without a single scratch. The central undeniable twist is this. The evidence strongly suggests that while Jenny was publicly fundraising for a surrogate to have Sumit's baby, Sumit was allegedly laying the groundwork for a new life. A life that shockingly may have already included a new wife and child. This isn't just a breakup. This is a Jenny was the last to know. Before we unravel the timeline that proves it, make no mistake. This channel is your front row seat to the raw, unfiltered truth of reality TV's darkest secrets. If you want to expose that name and connect the networks prey you miss, you need to hit subscribe and ring that bell right now. This is the deep dive TLC doesn't want you to see. So how did we get here? To understand the magnitude of the fall, we have to revisit the chaotic foundation. Jenny and Sumit's love story began not with a chance meeting, but with a deliberate fiction. A young Indian man, bored and curious, created a fake Facebook profile under the name Michael Jones. He used a photo of a handsome model crafting a digital phantom to chat with women from afar. His mark, Jenny Slatten, a 60-something American woman seeking connection. For 2 full years, Michael was her confidant, her digital romance. The emotional investment was total. Then the bomb dropped. Michael confessed he wasn't real, but instead of ending the charade, he offered a tantalizing replacement. His real self, Sumit Singh. This wasn't an apology. It was a pivot. The first of many deceptions. Jenny, already emotionally entangled, chose to see this not as a staggering red flag, but as a romantic hurdle. She forgave him. This single decision set the precedent for the next decade. Jenny forgiving the unforgivable and Sumit learning that the boundaries of their relationship were endlessly flexible. The catfish was merely the opening act. When Jenny, fueled by this forgive and forget mentality, first traveled to India to meet Sumit in person, she was hit with deception number 2. Sumit's family, traditional and conservative, had no idea about the American grandmother their son was involved with. But the bigger shock was still backstage. Sumit was not just a single man living at home. He was a married man living at home. He had a wife arranged by his family. This fact had been conveniently omitted during his years of online courtship. Imagine the scene. Jenny, having crossed oceans for love, discovers her soulmate as another woman's husband. The betrayal was monumental. Yet again, the pattern held. Sumit framed it as a prison of tradition, a marriage he never wanted, and painted himself as the victim. Jenny again saw a project she would be his savior. Sumit eventually divorced his wife, but at a tremendous financial and social cost. A cost Jenny would help shoulder both emotionally and, as we'll see, financially. The marriage proves Sumit's capacity for monumental secrecy, especially when it came to the women in his life. With the wife ostensibly out of the picture, the battlefield shifted to Sumit's family. Their disapproval wasn't just mild discomfort. It was volcanic. Jenny, a foreigner decades older than their son, represented a social catastrophe for them. The drama played out on global television with Sumit's mother wailing, crying, and begging her son to choose his family. Sumit for his first few seasons played the torn lover caught between his family's honor and his heart. But his actions often spoke louder than his reality TV confessionals. He would frequently buckle under family pressure, leaving Jenny in tears and in limbo. Their relationship became a cycle. A visa expiration, a tearful goodbye at the airport, a period of long-distance compromises followed by a new visa, and a turbulent reunion. With every Jenny's roots in America withered while her investment in Sumit and India deepened. She sold her belongings, left her family, and poured her life savings into a dream that existed solely in the space between Sumit's assurances and his family's acceptance. The power dynamic was now fully cemented. Jenny had everything to lose, and Sumit held all the keys. The financial bleed began. Slowly, then became a torrent. First, it was the constant international flights back and forth as visa rules forced her to leave the country every then. It was the cost of living, though modest in India, entirely funded by Jenny's dwindling American savings and her social security income. Then came the business ventures. Remember the dream of the cafe? A quaint little spot they would run together, a symbol of their joint future. Jenny invested more money, thousands of dollars into this plan. It never materialized. The reasons changed. Permits, location, family opposition. The money, however, was spent. Simultaneously, the show 90 Day Fiancé began paying them. They joined the lucrative convention and cameo circuit. Where did that income go? While it's clear Jenny was funding their daily life, the question of what happened to their shared entertainment income remains a murky, crucial mystery. By the time the surrogacy conversation entered the picture, Jenny's financial reservoir was critically low, but her emotional investment was at an all-time high. So when Sumit began expressing his deep cultural need for a child, a need that his aging American girlfriend could not biologically fulfill, the solution presented itself as both a romantic gesture and a final binding investment. The surrogate plan was born. But what the audience saw on television was a romantic dream, a desperate couple trying to beat biology, an older woman willing to sacrifice everything for the man she loved. What the audience did not see was the shadow story forming behind the scenes. A story that would eventually expose a decade-long emotional investment turning into the most devastating financial and emotional loss of Jenny Slatton's life. Because while Jenny was publicly fundraising for a surrogate, sharing her hope, her vulnerability, and her desperation with fans around the world, Sumit was allegedly laying the groundwork for a new life that shockingly may have already included a new wife and a child. And this is not speculation for shock value. This is a pattern that started with catfishing, escalated to a secret marriage, and may have ended with Jenny being the last person to know the truth yet again. And that is the core tragedy here. Jenny did not just lose a man, she lost 10 years, she lost her financial stability, she lost her dream of family, and she lost her future. While the man she called her husband seemingly walked away without a single scratch, emotionally, financially, socially, or legally. And to understand how this happened, we must dissect every stage of this relationship, every turning point, every red flag, every financial decision, every emotional concession, and every lie that was forgiven. Because this was not a single betrayal. This was a system of betrayal, a system that rewarded deception and punished loyalty. And Jenny remained loyal to the bitter end, even when loyalty cost her everything. When the surrogacy storyline emerged, it was presented as a symbol of hope, a last chance at stage of their relationship. Despite her age, despite her financial strain, despite her physical exhaustion, she was willing to pursue surrogacy, not because it was her dream, but because it was his. And that distinction is crucial, because every major sacrifice in this relationship flowed in one direction, from Jenny to Sumit, not from Sumit to Jenny. And yet the narrative presented to viewers often framed Sumit as the victim, the man trapped between love and culture, tradition and freedom, family and heart. But the deeper reality shows a man who consistently positioned himself as powerless while exercising immense control over Jenny's life, her finances, her location, her future, and her emotional stability. The surrogacy discussions began at a time when Jenny was already financially vulnerable, her savings were nearly depleted, her social security income was her primary source of support, and her ability to return to the United States and rebuild was becoming more limited by age, finances, and emotional attachment. Yet she agreed to pursue one of the most expensive and complex family-building processes available. In a country where surrogacy laws were shifting, regulations were tightening, and foreign participation was increasingly restricted, and this should have been a red flag, not just legally, but logically, because it made little sense for a man with limited income, no stable employment, and no financial assets to push for a child when the woman he was with could barely support herself. But logic has never been the currency of this relationship, emotion has. And emotion has always worked in Sumit's favor. Jenny began speaking publicly about fundraising, about needing help, about hoping fans would support them, and she framed it as a shared dream, a joint effort, a future they were building together. But this public vulnerability stands in stark contrast to the alleged private reality, where Sumit was reportedly already creating distance, already emotionally disengaging, already planning a life that may not have included Jenny at all. And this is where the evidence becomes chilling, because according to multiple reports, rumors and insider claims, Sumit may have already remarried, and not just remarried, but had a child, while Jenny was still believing she was working toward becoming a mother with him. Now let's pause and examine the gravity of that claim, because this is not just cheating, this is not just emotional betrayal, this is a full-scale replacement, a life swap, a silent exit from one life into another, while leaving the former partner emotionally, financially, and psychologically stranded. And if this is true, then the surrogacy storyline becomes not just tragic, but grotesque, because it means Jenny was being encouraged to invest her last financial resources into a future that Sumit had already abandoned, And that is not just manipulation, that is exploitation. To understand how this could happen, we must revisit the core psychological dynamic of this relationship, because from the very beginning, Sumit learned that Jenny's love was unconditional, and he learned this not through words, but through actions. When Jenny forgave him for catfishing, she taught him that deception did not disqualify him from love. When she forgave him for being married, she taught him that betrayal did not end the relationship. When she forgave him for repeatedly choosing his family over her, she taught him that abandonment did not lead to consequences. And when she continued to stay, continue to invest, continue to sacrifice, she taught him that he could push the boundaries indefinitely, and there would always be another chance, another forgiveness, another reset, another sacrifice, another excuse. And this pattern did not just shape their relationship, it shaped Sumit's behavior. Because behavior that is rewarded will continue, and behavior that has no consequences will escalate. By the time surrogacy became a topic, Sumit had already been trained, consciously or unconsciously, that Jenny would do anything to keep him, including sacrificing her financial security, her dignity, her family relationships, her homeland, and now, potentially, her last chance at peace. And this is not a judgment of Jenny, this is an acknowledgement of trauma bonding, emotional dependency, and the psychological toll of long-term emotional manipulation. Because this was not a relationship of equals, this was a relationship where one person had everything to lose and the other had everything to gain. Jenny had already lost her home in America, she had already lost her social network, she had already lost financial independence, she had already lost years of her life that could have been spent building stability, security, and peace, and yet she continued to invest, because emotionally, she was already bankrupt, and emotionally bankrupt people often make the most expensive decisions, because they are not operating from a place of logic, they are operating from a place of survival, fear of abandonment, and hope that the next sacrifice will finally be the one that makes everything work. And this is where the surrogacy storyline becomes even more disturbing, because surrogacy was not just about having a child, it was about creating a permanent bond, a legal bond, a moral bond, a biological bond, something that would anchor Sumit to Jenny forever, something that would make leaving harder, something that would finally secure her place in his life. And yet, according to the evidence, Sumit may have already been preparing to leave, and not just leave, but replace her entirely. Now let's examine the timeline more closely, because timelines do not lie, even when people do. Jenny began publicly discussing surrogacy during a period when Sumit's behavior was reportedly shifting. He became more distant, less engaged, less emotionally available, more evasive about the future, more vague about plans, more defensive when questioned. And these are classic indicators of someone emotionally disengaging from a relationship, not someone preparing to build a family. And yet, the public narrative continued, the fundraising continued, the hope continued, and Jenny continued to believe. At the same time, reports began surfacing that Sumit had been seen with another woman, that he had possibly remarried, that there was a child involved. And while these reports were initially dismissed as rumors, the consistency of the claims, the pattern of behavior, and the lack of transparency from Sumit all contribute to a deeply troubling picture. Because if this were false, one would expect a clear denial, documentation, or at the very least, a coherent explanation. And instead, what we saw was silence, deflection, and disappearance, which are not the behaviors of an innocent man, they are the behaviors of someone trying to control the narrative by avoiding it altogether. Jenny, meanwhile, was left in the dark, not just about the alleged new wife and child, but about the true state of her relationship, about the future, about finances, about legal status, about emotional commitment, about everything. And this is not just negligence, this is emotional abandonment, because abandonment does not always come in the form of leaving. Sometimes it comes in the form of staying physically while leaving emotionally, mentally, and morally, and that appears to be exactly what happened here. As Jenny continued to age, her options narrowed, not because she was unworthy of love, but because she had invested everything into a investment left her with nothing to fall back on, no savings, no home, no safety net, no independent income, and no emotional support system outside of Sumit. And that level of dependency creates a power imbalance that is extremely dangerous, because the person with less power becomes more willing to accept unacceptable behavior, and the person with more power becomes more willing to engage in it. Now let's talk about the financial dimension, because this is not just a love story, this is a financial tragedy. Jenny spent tens of thousands of dollars over the years, on flights, on visas, on living expenses, on legal fees, on business ventures, on day-to-day support, and potentially, on surrogacy planning, and yet, she has nothing to show for it, no business, no property, no child, no marriage security, no retirement plan, no financial cushion, and at her age, rebuilding from scratch is not just difficult, it is devastating. Meanwhile, Sumit, despite contributing little financially, benefited from Jenny's financial support, her television income, her public platform, her fan base, her sacrifices, her emotional labor, her patience, her forgiveness, and her loyalty. And if the reports are true, he then walked away from all of that into a new life, with a new wife, a new child, and a clean slate. And if that is not the definition of walking away without a scratch, then what is? And here's where the narrative becomes not just tragic but infuriating, because Jenny did not just lose a relationship, she lost a decade of her life that she can never get back. She lost the opportunity to build stability, she lost the opportunity to invest in her own future, she lost the opportunity to experience peace, and she lost the opportunity to protect herself because she believed in love. She believed in redemption, she believed in second chances, she believed in forgiveness, and she believed that if she loved hard enough, sacrificed enough, endured enough, waited long enough, everything would eventually work out, and instead, everything fell apart. The psychological toll of this cannot be overstated, because long-term emotional manipulation does not just hurt in the moment, it reshapes a person's identity, it erodes self-trust, it undermines self-worth, it creates confusion, it creates self-doubt, it creates guilt, it creates shame, it creates fear, and it creates a distorted sense of reality, where the victim begins to question their own perceptions, their own instincts, their own judgment. And this is exactly what we saw with Jenny. She repeatedly questioned herself, blamed herself, doubted herself, and minimized her own pain, while excusing Sumit's behavior. And that is not weakness, that is trauma. And yet, despite all of this, Jenny continued to show up, she continued to hope, she continued to invest, she continued to love. And that is what makes this story so heartbreaking, because this is not a story of foolishness, this is a story of trust, vulnerability, and emotional commitment being weaponized against someone who simply wanted to be loved, wanted to belong, and wanted to build a life with someone who promised her everything and delivered almost nothing. Now let's examine the idea of replacement, because this is where the story becomes even darker. The concept that while Jenny was fighting for their relationship, Sumit may have already been building another one, is not just betrayal, it is erasure. It is as if Jenny's entire existence in his life was being overwritten, replaced, and deleted, and that kind of betrayal is not just emotional, it is existential. Because it forces the victim to question whether any of it was real, whether any of the love was genuine, whether any of the promises were sincere, and whether any of the sacrifices meant anything at all. If Sumit did indeed remarry and have a child while Jenny was still believing they were pursuing surrogacy together, then the surrogacy storyline becomes not just a lie, but a cruel performance, a performance designed to maintain control, to maintain sympathy, to maintain access to financial resources, to maintain public support, and to maintain Jenny's emotional investment, and that level of manipulation is not accidental. It is deliberate. Now let's talk about motive, because people do not behave this way without motive, and the motive here appears to be security, stability, and social acceptance, things that Jenny could never provide in the context of Sumit's culture, family, and society, no matter how much she loved him, no matter how much she sacrificed, no matter how much she endured, because in his world, age, nationality, family approval, and social norms matter. And Jenny represented none of those things, and while he may have loved her in some capacity, love is not always enough to overcome social pressure, cultural expectations, and personal ambition. It is entirely possible that Sumit reached a point where he realized he could not build the life he wanted with Jenny, but instead of being honest, instead of ending the relationship, instead of taking responsibility, he chose to create a parallel life, a secret life, a replacement life, while allowing Jenny to continue believing in a future that no longer existed, and that is not just cowardice, that is cruelty. Now let's examine the emotional timeline, because Jenny's emotional journey over the years reveals a steady progression from hope to confusion, from confusion to anxiety, from anxiety to despair, from despair to desperation, and from desperation to emotional collapse. And this is evident in her demeanor, her words, her expressions, her tone, her body language, and her decisions. She became more fragile, more uncertain, more anxious, more dependent, and more emotionally exhausted. And yet, she continued to fight for the relationship, because when you have invested everything, walking away feels like admitting that everything was for nothing, and that is a psychological burden that many people cannot bear. The surrogacy storyline, in particular, reflects the depth of Jenny's desperation, because surrogacy is not a casual decision, it is a complex, expensive, emotionally charged process that requires stability, security, and mutual commitment, and Jenny pursued it not from a position of strength, but from a position of fear of losing Sumit, fear of being alone, fear of having wasted her life, fear of starting over, and fear of facing the reality that the man she loved may never truly choose her. And that fear is exactly what made her vulnerable, because fear overrides logic, fear overrides caution, fear overrides self-protection, and fear creates the conditions for exploitation, and that is what appears to have happened here. Now let's talk about accountability, Because accountability has been largely absent from this narrative, Sumit has rarely been held fully accountable for his actions, his lies, his secrecy, his deception, his financial dependence, his emotional manipulation, and his abandonment, and instead, the narrative has often focused on cultural differences, family pressure, and generational conflict, which, while real, do not excuse deception, betrayal, or exploitation, and it is time to separate cultural context from personal responsibility, because culture may influence behavior, but it does not justify harm. Jenny, on the other hand, has paid the full price for every mistake. Every compromise, every forgiveness, every sacrifice, and every hope, and she has done so not just financially, but emotionally, psychologically, and existentially, because her entire life trajectory was altered by this relationship, and not in a positive way. Now let's consider the long-term impact, because the damage does not end with the relationship, it extends into the future. Jenny now faces aging with limited financial resources, limited emotional support, and the trauma of a decade-long emotional investment that ended in betrayal, and rebuilding at this stage of life is not just challenging, it is overwhelming, because the margin for error is small, the time horizon is shorter, and the emotional resilience required is immense. And yet, Jenny must now do exactly that: rebuild, heal, and find meaning in a life that was derailed by a relationship that promised everything and delivered pain. And this is where the story transcends reality television and becomes a cautionary tale, not just about love, but about power, dependency, boundaries, and self-worth, because this is not just about Jenny and Sumit, this is about the dangers of unconditional forgiveness, the dangers of sacrificing oneself for another, the dangers of ignoring red flags, the dangers of emotional dependency, and the dangers of believing that love alone can overcome deception, cultural barriers, financial instability, and incompatible life goals. Now let's talk about the role of the audience, because the audience was not just a passive observer, the audience was emotionally invested, financially supportive, and psychologically engaged, and many viewers supported Jenny, donated to her fundraising efforts, defended her, empathized with her, and hoped for her happiness. And if the allegations are true, then not only was Jenny betrayed, but the audience was as well, because they were led to believe in a narrative that may not have been real, and they may have unknowingly contributed to a financial and emotional situation that was based on deception. And this raises serious ethical questions about reality television, about transparency, about accountability, and about the responsibility of networks, producers, and participants to tell the truth, especially when real people's lives, finances, and futures are at stake. Because this is not just entertainment, this is real life, real pain, real loss, and real consequences. Now let's examine the emotional aftermath, because emotional aftermath is where the real story continues. Jenny has been left not just heartbroken, but disoriented, disillusioned, and destabilized, because when a relationship ends,